The room had gone silent, the kind of silence that makes the air feel thick and electric. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle near his temple twitched. In front of him lay the stack of documents I had just placed there, quiet, heavy, undeniable. His fingers trembled as he flipped through each notarized page, the candlelight catching the sheen of the embossed seals. Across from him, Mark's confident smirk collapsed into something sour, almost frightened. The business partners men my father had admired and courted for decades leaned in with raised eyebrows, their interest sharpening by the second. I didn't say a word. I just watched the moment his certainty snapped, watched the truth sink its teeth into him. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time in my life, Richard Coleman looked small, and all I could think was, this was the day he finally realized he'd underestimated the wrong person. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Anna Coleman. I'm 33 years old, and until recently most people would have described me as the quiet, dependable one in my family. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't the center of attention, and I never cared much for the spotlight. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a house where the walls were lined with family photos, though strangely most of them featured my younger brother Mark, even during the years when I was the one bringing home trophies, medals, and academic awards. If you asked my father why, he'd say it was because Mark had a natural presence. What he meant was that Mark was the son he'd always imagined having, and I was, well, the daughter he didn't really know what to do with. My father came from the old-school mold-firm handshake firm. Opinions, firmer beliefs about what made a person strong. He loved to talk about grit and leadership. He admired boldness in men and compliance in women. If you weren't either of those things, he didn't know where to put you. Growing up, I learned quickly that my victories were accidents, and my failures were expected. If I aced a test, he'd nod and say not to get too full of myself. If Mark closed a minor deal at the company, Dad would throw a barbecue and call him the next big thing. Over time, you stop pressing for attention you know you'll never get. I poured my energy into work because it was the one place where results couldn't be twisted into something smaller. 9 years at an engineering firm, several major projects, inventions. I was proud of teams that trusted me. It was the kind of career that hums in the background of your life. You don't boast about it. You just show up and do the job well. I was content with that. At least I thought I was. The day I lost my job, everything shifted. My manager had looked me in the eyes with a kind of empty apology, polished from too many corporate trainings. Downsizing, restructuring, nothing personal. It always feels personal when your whole identity is built on proving yourself. I drove home in silence, thinking maybe this was the moment my father would surprise me. Maybe he'd see me as human for once. Maybe he'd understand that losing something you dedicated your life to isn't a moral failure. But the second I stepped through the door, he didn't even try to hide the satisfaction in his voice. 9 years, he said loudly, as though announcing it to an audience. 9 years and nothing to show for it. I told you this would happen. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He didn't even let me sit down before he started picking apart my entire career like it had always been a waste of time. My brother sat back in his chair swirling his drink, letting Dad do the speaking. He didn't need to add anything. His smug little smile did the job. My father didn't just criticize me. He made sure everyone at the dinner table heard every word. My aunts, my cousins, all of them sitting there pretending not to notice how small he was trying to make me feel. I remember staring down at my hands, feeling that old familiar heaviness settle into my chest. The weight of being the overlooked one, the one written off before she even opens her mouth. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was that hollow ache you get when you realize someone you love genuinely enjoys watching you break. That night was the first time I felt something dangerous inside me shift. It wasn't a snap or an explosion. It was quieter than that, steady cold, unmistakable. A realization that I didn't need his approval and maybe never had. But he didn't know that yet. He thought this was the moment he had finally proven his point, that I would always be second place, always be replaceable, always be less. He had no idea how wrong he was. and he had no idea how close he was to the first crack in the world he built, around Mark cracks that would soon split wide open. I was 11 the night my father held up Mark's Little League trophy and told the entire living room that he finally had a real winner in the family. The house smelled like grilled burgers and charcoal. The sliding door cracked open to let in the humid Raleigh air. I had just come home from the regional science fair, clutching a blue ribbon still warm from the judge's hands. But no one looked up when I walked in. Mark was on my father's shoulders, beaming while the adults clapped their voices, echoing off the hardwood floors. I stood in the doorway, sweaty and hopeful, waiting for my dad to turn around. He never did. I remember lowering my ribbon, letting it hang behind my leg where no one could see it. For a moment, I thought about clearing my throat, speaking up, saying something. Instead, I stepped back into the hallway and slipped the ribbon into my backpack before anyone noticed I was home at all. Years later, that moment still plays in the back of my mind like a scene from a home movie I never asked to keep. It took me a long time to understand that the silence I chose that night wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Growing up in the Coleman house was like living in a spotlight that always tilted slightly to the right. My father believed boys were born leaders and girls were better off as ornaments to their accomplishments. He didn't say it outright, but it seeped into every holiday, every birthday, every casual comment he tossed across the dinner table. Mark's school projects got framed and hung in the hallway. Mine got clipped to the refrigerator for a week before disappearing. When I came home with a perfect report card, Dad would pat my shoulder and say, "Good, but don't let it go to your head." When Mark barely scraped by in math, Dad would chuckle and say, "He's a real-world thinker. That's the kind that succeeds." There was a pattern to the praise and the criticism, and even as a child I learned the rhythm. If I wanted approval, it had to go through Mark first. If something good happened to me, the safest thing to do was keep it quiet. Achievements weren't celebrations. They were landmines waiting for someone to tell me I was taking up too much space. By the time I hit high school, I had mastered the art of shrinking. I stopped volunteering answers in class even when I knew them. I slipped into clubs where I could work quietly in the background. I chose engineering because numbers made sense, because data didn't care who you were or how loudly your father spoke at Thanksgiving. Numbers rewarded effort, not charm. Equations didn't smirk at you from across a dining table. At home, though, nothing changed. When Mark joined the debate team, Dad cleared his work schedule to attend every meet. When I received a scholarship letter for a summer research program, Dad told me not to get too excited because those things fall through all the time. I remember reading that letter 3 times before tucking it into a drawer. I still went to the program, but I didn't mention it again. Mark, meanwhile, learned early that attention was his currency. He strutted through life with the confidence of someone who never had to question whether he belonged. When he failed, Dad called it character building. When I stumbled, Dad called it proof. I absorbed every word, every sigh, every dismissive glance. I don't think he realized how much his voice shaped the one inside my own head. College didn't free me from the old patterns as much as I'd hoped. I graduated with honors, but when I came home with the news, Dad asked if the ceremony was worth attending, or if I'd already gotten everything out of it. Mark, who had taken a year off to figure things out, got a new watch and a steak dinner to celebrate his growth. I remember sitting across from them in that restaurant, the soft glow of overhead lights reflecting off my water glass, thinking that no matter how far I ran, their version of me would always follow. My first job was the one place where I felt the ground level out. My manager valued consistency. My teammates valued competence. I learned how to lead projects, how to navigate pressure, how to speak without bracing for a blow. But at home, my father never let me forget that I was lucky to be there. If I mentioned a successful quarter, he'd say the market must have been kind. If I talked about a new patent filing, he'd shrug and say patents were just paperwork until someone else proved them worthwhile. It wasn't that he hated me. I don't think he ever understood me. In his mind, ambition belonged to men. Women were support beams, not architects. Anything I built was a fluke. Anything Mark attempted was destiny. I became an expert at staying quiet. Not because I lacked confidence, but because speaking up felt like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. I swallowed 1,000 small humiliations, missed acknowledgments, undercut achievements, backhanded compliments, until silence felt safer than truth. You start to believe the lines drawn around you are permanent. You start to think you deserve the smaller chair, the softer voice, the thinner slice of pride. And every time I tried to challenge that belief, something in my father's tone would pull me right back. A raised eyebrow, a dismissive laugh, a comment he'd toss out at a family cookout, something like, "Don't worry, Anna's doing fine in her little corner," as though I'd built myself a cage and didn't even know it. I can still picture the living room during Christmas the year I turned 25. Dad sat in his armchair handing out envelopes, small holiday bonuses for the family members who worked in the business. Mark received his envelope with a flourish, Dad giving a speech about leadership potential and the bright future ahead. When he handed me mine, he didn't even look up from the stack. "Yours is modest," he said, "but that's appropriate for where you are." I remember folding the envelope in half just to keep my hands from trembling. I hadn't expected much, but the casual way he dismissed me made the room feel colder, the lights feel dimmer. The truth is, long before I lost my job, I had been losing pieces of myself. Not because I wasn't capable, but because the people who should have taught me my worth were too busy measuring me against a bar they never intended to let me reach. By the time I stepped into adulthood, I carried those old wounds like invisible bruises. They didn't stop me from succeeding, but they shaped how I interpreted it. Every win felt temporary. Every compliment felt conditional. Every achievement came with a question mark. Even when I invented something that would eventually change everything, my first instinct wasn't pride. It was fear. Fear of losing it. Fear of someone claiming it. Fear that maybe my father was right and I was just stumbling into something beyond my depth. Walter saw my hesitation before I did. He told me I had built something meaningful, something worthy. I wanted to believe him. But years of being told I was less had made belief a muscle I didn't know how to flex. I often wonder how different my life would have been if my father had looked at me just once the way he looked at Mark, full of confidence, full of expectation, full of belief. But he didn't. And because he didn't, I learned to build myself in the quiet. I learned to chase excellence without applause. I learned to fight for space without asking permission. By the time I lost my job, the sting wasn't just about the layoff. It was about how familiar the sting felt. It was the echo of every time I'd been told I wasn't quite enough. Every time I'd been expected to step aside so someone else could shine. Every time I'd been made to believe that my successes were accidents and my failures were inevitable. But something was different now. I wasn't 11 anymore hiding a blue ribbon in my backpack. I wasn't 16 hearing my father call Mark the real leader. I wasn't 25 folding a thin holiday envelope to stop my hands from shaking. I was 33, and beneath all that old hurt, something stronger had taken root. Because even though my past had taught me to be silent, the present was about to force a truth into the open one that would make silence impossible. Something was coming. Something my father never saw coming. And soon, the years of being overlooked wouldn't just crack his version of me, they would shatter it. I first saw the numbers on a night when the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. The bank statements lay scattered across my kitchen table, printed in sharp black ink that seemed to glow under the overhead light. 3 accounts each bearing my name as guarantor, each with balances that made my stomach tighten. My finger traced the latest charge, an Aspen resort suite, booked just days after my father told me I needed to start over somewhere smaller. Another page showed a luxury dealership in Charlotte, a down payment I didn't recognize. Then, a string of charges from high-end restaurants I had never stepped inside. I flipped the statements faster now, my breath shallow, each page landing like a fresh blow. The numbers weren't mistakes. They weren't misprints. They were precise, intentional, and months deep. And every dollar had been spent by my father and Mark using credit lines tied to my name. Credit lines I didn't even know were still open. I sat back slowly, the paper edges still warm from my hands, and felt the room tilt around me. For a moment, I couldn't decide if the shock or the clarity hit harder. The truth had been sitting in the dark for a long time. I just hadn't opened the right drawer until now. The deeper I went into those financial records, the more the story began to stitch itself together thread by thread. I remembered the day Caroline mentioned seeing Mark at a dealership using the family line. I'd brushed it off as old information, assuming those accounts were closed years ago. But the statements said otherwise. They painted a portrait far less innocent, far more calculated. These weren't occasional charges or harmless mix-ups. They were patterns, lavish, bold, reckless patterns built on the assumption that I would never look closely, never question, never disrupt. As I studied the dates, I saw something even worse. The timeline overlapped perfectly with my darkest months at work, when I was juggling back-to-back projects, barely sleeping, carrying the team through tight deadlines. While I was grinding through 18-hour days, my father and brother had been using my name as a safety net, siphoning from accounts that legally tied responsibility back to me. They'd been spending freely while assuming I would stay too overwhelmed, too obedient to notice. It wasn't new behavior. It was simply louder now, more obvious, like someone yelling in a room where they once whispered. I leaned back in my chair, the rustle of the papers settling like the echo of a truth I hadn't wanted to see. My father had always believed his decisions were the natural order of things. He'd never asked me what I wanted because he assumed he already knew the limits of my capacity. Mark never hesitated to take advantage of the privileges Dad handed him because he'd been taught the world would bend for him. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to read every page again. The figures weren't what hurt. What hurt was the certainty with which they had done it. They had used my name without hesitation, without fear of consequence, because in their minds I didn't get to have boundaries. I was the one expected to stay grateful, stay quiet, stay small. Yet hidden in that discovery was something new, something sharp, electrifying, undeniable. This wasn't just carelessness. This was misuse entitlement, a deliberate assumption that I would always be the one cleaning up after their choices. The same pattern from childhood, only now with financial teeth. The next morning I drove to my financial advisor's office with the file folder on the passenger seat. The weight of it felt different now, not humiliating, not frightening. It felt like proof. When Scott spread the documents across his desk, he frowned, then looked up at me with a seriousness I'd rarely seen from him. "You want to freeze these?" he asked. My answer came without hesitation. Yes. All of them. He studied me for a moment as though trying to gauge whether I understood the storm this would create. I understood. I simply no longer cared. As he notarized the forms, I felt a quiet shift inside me, a kind of awakening. A part of me that had been bent for years slowly straightened like a spine, relearning its original shape. When the last signature dried, I felt the final click of something locking into place. That afternoon, my phone lit up with Dad's name, just as I stepped out into the afternoon sun. His voice on the voicemail trembled with barely contained outrage, demanding an explanation, accusing me of sabotaging the family. I let it ring again and again. The silence on my end wasn't fear anymore, it was power. But freezing the accounts was only the beginning. Once I opened the financial files, I couldn't seem to stop uncovering more. As I dug through old emails and company documents I still had access to, I found trails of decisions my father had made months earlier, subtle shifts in power changes, in voting rights exclusions from meetings, where my input had once been central. It was all there hidden in polite corporate language and conveniently buried memos. He had begun edging me out long before my job disappeared, building a runway for Mark to slide into the role he'd always imagined for him. And I had been too overwhelmed, too loyal to see it. The realization cut deeper than any bank statement. My father hadn't just doubted me. He'd planned for my absence. He'd mapped it out like a business strategy, ensuring that when the day came, Mark would be elevated and I would be diminished. It wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was deliberate erasure. I closed my eyes at my kitchen counter, my hands gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. All those nights he'd told me I wasn't built for leadership. All those moments he'd lifted Mark higher while nudging me aside. They had been rehearsals for this final act, and I had walked right into it because some part of me still believed he might see me differently if I just kept trying. But the evidence in front of me erased every illusion. I wasn't losing my place in the family business I had been removed, and yet, beneath the anger rising in slow, steady waves, something else stirred. A clarity that steadied my breath, My father had built his entire identity on control over the business, over Mark, over me. Control through narrative, through money, through manipulation. But he couldn't control what he didn't know. He didn't know about the nights in the rented lab. He didn't know about the invention. He didn't know about the patent. He didn't know about the $94 million wire transfer that sealed my independence long before he tried to strip me of it. He had spent months preparing to discard me, completely unaware that I had already freed myself. The final piece of the truth wasn't about money, it was about perspective. For years, I believed silence protected me. But now, I saw it clearly. Silence had been the cage he kept me in. I spread the documents across my dining table, financial records, patent confirmation trust paperwork, old family business memos. It wasn't just evidence. It was a map of every moment he had underestimated me, every time he had mistaken my restraint for weakness. I had been playing the wrong game. He had been playing the short one: public praise, private control, loud declarations of Mark's greatness. And I had been playing the long one: quiet work, careful planning truth that didn't need applause to exist. By the time I stacked the papers back into the envelope, my decision was already made. The discovery wasn't simply about frozen accounts or hidden motives. It was about finally seeing every piece of the puzzle that had shaped my life, and knowing that the only thing left to do was bring those pieces into the light. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, envelope in hand, the late afternoon sun casting a long shadow across the floor. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't conflicted. It was time. My father had spent years telling the world who I was. Now I would show him who he'd never bothered to see. And when the moment came, I would not whisper. I would not shrink. I would confront him with the truth he never imagined I had the power to hold. My father's voice had just reached its loudest point when I rose from my chair. Crystal glasses stilled, forks froze halfway to plates. The long oak conference table, ringed with my father's partners and trusted staff, seemed to tilt as every gaze shifted toward me. My heels echoed against the polished floor as I walked to the head of the room, the thick envelope in my hand, tapping lightly against my thigh. Dad's smile faltered when I set it in front of him. Mark leaned forward, smirk ready, until I pulled the first document free. Gasps broke across the room like a sudden storm. I laid down the next sheet, then the next, the bold black numbers striking the table with each drop. My father's color drained. Mark choked on his breath. And when I placed the notarized statement signed by someone who should never have touched my name, every voice died completely. You could hear the burn of the fluorescent lights overhead, and that's the moment the scales finally tipped. You see, the truth didn't arrive in a single blow. It gathered, it built, it pushed until I could no longer carry it quietly. In the week after freezing the accounts, something in me sharpened. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in clarity. I knew that confronting my father in private would do nothing. He lived in shadows and whispered deals and half-truths. Everything he controlled because no one else ever saw the full picture. So I decided the confrontation would happen in the one place he believed he was untouchable: a quarterly board meeting of the Coleman Family Company, a room of people who had admired him for years, a room where he had planned once again to parade Mark as the chosen heir. I spent 3 nights preparing, not just gathering statements and financial records, but assembling something more important, every thread of the truth they'd hoped would stay buried. And tucked in the stack was a separate document I'd found by accident, one that turned my stomach cold, a form bearing my signature from months earlier, except I had never signed it. It was dated the same week Dad began removing me from decision-making meetings. Someone had forged my approval to relinquish my voting rights, and the handwriting looked disturbingly familiar. That became the center of my resolve. When the day of the meeting arrived, I dressed simply: dark slacks, a navy blouse, nothing that screamed for attention. I didn't need theatrics. The truth would be loud enough. Dad was already working the room when I arrived, shaking hands, laughing too hard at small jokes, slapping Mark on the back. Mark stood there in a custom suit, enjoying how eyes lingered on him with expectation. I took my seat at the far end without a word. The meeting rolled on. Dad presented numbers, Mark added commentary, as though he'd been steering operations for years. I watched quietly, my envelope resting on my lap, my fingers curled around its edge like an anchor. Then, near the end of the agenda, Dad began his favorite speech about leadership stability and the future of our legacy. That was my moment. I rose as if pulled by a thread. The room went still, confusion flickering through the air like static. Dad paused mid-sentence, surprised that I'd interrupted him at all. "Is there something you want to say, Anna?" he asked, his voice tight. I didn't answer. I walked, slow, steady steps until I stood beside him at the front of the room, a place he never expected I'd have the audacity to stand. I placed the envelope in front of him. "Open it," I said. The first document slid out a statement of all 3 credit accounts tied to my name. The color drained from his face as he scanned the charges. Mark sat up straight, his smirk slipping. People in the room exchanged unsure glances. Dad swallowed. "What is this supposed to imply?" My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It's not an implication. It's evidence. The next sheet hit the table: travel expenses, dealership receipts, restaurant charges. The timeline spoke for itself. "You used my name," I said, "for months, without permission." Someone near the end of the table murmured, "My God." Dad tried to recover. "This is a misunderstanding. These accounts were established years ago. You knew they existed." I turned the page slowly. "No. You forgot that I keep records of what I authorize." Then I placed the forged document on the table. A hush rolled through the room. It was the form removing my voting rights. The notary stamp crisped the signature meant to look like mine, not perfect, but close enough that Dad must have thought I'd never see it. I looked straight at Mark. His eyes widened. Because the handwriting, it was his. The room stirred with sharp intakes of breath. Chairs creaked. Someone whispered, "That's a felony." My father whipped toward him. "Mark, what did you—" Mark stammered in incoherent denial, his voice cracking. I didn't." "She's lying." I placed beside it an email printout I'd pulled from an old backup, an email where Mark told a junior project manager to make sure Anna's sign-off doesn't hold up the transition, and attached the draft of the very form now on the table. He had slipped. He had left a trail. Dad's face went gray. "You forged my signature," I said, my voice like steel, "to push me out, to make sure I couldn't stop your little succession plan." Eyes around the table widened further. No one looked at my father with admiration anymore. Dad sputtered, "Anna, lower your voice." "No." I met his stare without blinking. "You tried to erase me. Financially, legally, professionally. And you used my own name to fund your lifestyle while doing it." Mark jumped to his feet. "You don't understand how business works." The words landed with the pathetic weight of a child caught stealing, still insisting the candy wasn't in his pocket. I lifted the last document from the envelope, my patent sale record, the trust account verification, the date, the total, every detail indisputable, and I laid it in front of them all. "This," I said quietly, "is what I built while you both were busy writing me off." A ripple spread across the room, astonishment, respect, a dawning awareness that they had all underestimated me simply because my father taught them to. Dad's jaw trembled. You hid this from me." "No," I answered. "I simply didn't hand it to you." The partners exchanged glances, their loyalties shifting in real time. The quiet one, Mr. Ellis, let out a low whistle. "$94 million, he murmured. "Incredible work, Miss Coleman." Dad's chair scraped against the carpet as he stood shaking with anger. "You embarrassed me. You humiliated your own family." I cut him off. "You did that. Every time you took something from me and gave it to Mark. Every time you spoke for me, talked over me, dismissed me. Every time you decided my life without asking me. This," I gestured at the documents, "isn't humiliation. It's truth." Mark lunged forward with an accusation on his tongue, but his voice collapsed under the weight of the room turning on him. One partner raised his hand sharply. "I had no idea these accounts were tied to Anna." "Richard, you told us they'd been reassigned." Dad froze. The room went quiet again, this time with suspicion. Another partner added, "And you never disclosed she'd been removed from voting rights. That would invalidate several approvals made under that structure." A third shook his head. "This borders on fraud." Dad's facade cracked completely. "Everyone calm down," he said, his tone now brittle. "This is a family matter." "No," Mr. Ellis said, rising. "This is a governance matter." And with that single sentence, my father's power, built on decades of intimidation and charm, collapsed like rotten wood. The balance had shifted. No yelling, no vengeance. Just consequences, exactly where they belonged. I gathered the documents, sliding them back into the envelope. Dad's voice trailed after me, fractured and desperate, but I didn't stop. I didn't need to, because the room no longer answered to him. As I reached the door, a silence fell so complete it felt like snowfall. Dozens of eyes followed me, not with pity, but with recognition. Recognition of the daughter who was never supposed to stand up. Recognition of the woman who finally did. I paused with my hand on the doorframe, letting the moment settle. Behind me, Dad called my name once, then twice, each attempt weaker than the last. I didn't turn around. I stepped out into the hallway, letting the door close behind me with a soft, decisive click. And for the first time in my life, he was the one left standing in silence. The hallway outside the boardroom felt impossibly quiet, as if the walls themselves were taking a long breath after the chaos I had left behind. My footsteps echoed in a steady rhythm, softer now, no longer fueled by adrenaline, but by something deeper: relief, maybe even release. The cool air met my skin like a calming hand on the shoulder, and for the first time in years, I felt a lightness settle across my chest. Behind me, the muffled voices rose, then dropped again, a distant storm I no longer needed to outrun. The envelope, once heavy with dread and truth, now felt weightless, tucked under my arm. I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, and the warmth on my face felt like a new beginning, quietly announcing itself. It's strange how quickly a life can shift once you stop fighting to belong where you were never welcomed. In the days that followed, everything inside me began to slow, then steady. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't reach for old patterns. Instead, I allowed myself to sit with what had changed, what had ended, and what was finally free to begin. The legal side of things moved with surprising ease after that meeting. With the forged signature exposed and the financial misuse laid bare, the company's attorneys worked quickly to untangle me from any remaining obligations. Each document they sent for my approval felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself, a gradual untying of knots I had lived with for too long. When the final release papers arrived, I read them twice, then signed with a calm that reached all the way down to my bones. I was no longer bound to a business that had never truly made room for me. My apartment became the place where the deepest parts of my healing started to take shape. At first, it was just a quiet space with white walls and a single couch, but slowly it became something more like an extension of who I was becoming. I bought paint-soft sage for the living room, warm slate for the hallway, and spent an afternoon with the windows open, brush strokes forming their own rhythm across the walls. There was something grounding in the act, the way color covered emptiness and turned it into intention. With each corner I finished, I felt a little more present in a life that was finally mine. When Dad tried calling once, then twice, I didn't answer. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. His messages shifted from demanding explanations to strained attempts at normalcy, but even those carried the familiar pull of his expectations. I deleted each voicemail without listening to the end. Boundaries, I realized, didn't have to be loud to be firm. Distance could be an act of dignity, not defiance. Mark didn't reach out at all. It was a silence I welcomed. I wasn't alone, though. On a quiet evening not long after the confrontation, Dana stopped by with takeout and a soft smile, sensing I needed company even though I hadn't asked. We sat at my small kitchen table, the glow from the window warming the room as the sun dipped low. She listened, not the way people listen to gossip or drama, but the way a friend listens to understand how your heart is holding up. When I finally told her everything, she didn't react with shock or pity. She simply reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're finally breathing for yourself," she said. Her words settled into me like truth that had been waiting to be spoken. Walter called a few days later. His voice carried that familiar, steady warmth, the kind that always cut through uncertainty. He didn't ask about the confrontation. He only asked what I planned to build next. I didn't have an answer yet, but instead of feeling anxious, I felt something close to excitement. A blank page no longer looked like a threat. It looked like freedom. One morning, I drove out to the small storage unit where I'd kept my old notebooks, sketches, and half-finished prototypes. The early light filtered through the slats of the metal door as I lifted it, revealing shelves stacked with years of ideas that had never been given space to grow. Dust clung to the edges, but the potential inside that little room felt untouched. I carried the boxes out one by one, loading them into my car, with a sense of purpose that surprised me. These pieces of my past weren't reminders of what I'd lost. They were seeds of what I could still create. Back at my apartment, I cleared a corner of the living room and set up a modest workspace. A sturdy table, good lighting, tools arranged neatly in drawers. When I sat down for the first time, the chair felt like a seat I had earned not because someone gave it to me, but because I built it myself one decision at a time. There was no pressure to invent something groundbreaking, no voice hovering over my shoulder telling me what mattered or didn't. There was just the hum of possibility and the soft thrum of my own thoughts guiding me forward. Some days I sketched ideas, others I read others. I simply sat there letting the quiet wrap around me like a balm. What surprised me most was how calm everything felt. Healing didn't come with fireworks or grand revelations. It came in small, steady moments, the morning I opened the windows and let fresh air sweep through the rooms, the afternoon I planted a small herb garden on the balcony, the night I fell asleep without replaying any arguments in my mind. Bit by bit, I was stitching together a life that didn't revolve around trying to earn approval I never would have received. One weekend, I drove to a nearby lake, the same one I used to visit in college when I needed to think. I stood at the water's edge, the reflection of the sky rippling with the breeze, and let the quiet sink in. There was no one waiting for me to fail, no one rewriting my story before I could tell it myself. For the first time and as long as I could remember, the world felt wide again. Freedom wasn't just financial. It was the ability to choose peace over chaos, truth over validation, growth over old wounds. As weeks turned into months, I understood something I'd never allowed myself to believe. Before, I didn't need my father's respect to define me. I didn't need Mark's shadow to measure my worth. Everything they tried to take from me, confidence, independence, recognition, had simply pushed me toward building those things on my own terms. And standing on my balcony one quiet evening, the city lights stretching out beneath me, I felt something settle fully into place. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands steady and unshaken after everything that tried to break it. My life wasn't rebuilt in a single moment. It was reclaimed piece by piece in the decisions I made toward myself. And as I looked out at the horizon, a gentle certainty rose in my chest. I didn't need to return to the world I walked away from. I was already exactly where I belonged.